There is a medical report 6 pages long. It was compiled on the 26th of July, 1984, one day after Soviet cosmonaut Svetlana Savitskaya stepped outside the Salyut 7 space station and became the first woman in history to perform a spacewalk. The official Soviet chronicles celebrated it as a technical triumph. Newspapers printed her photograph. Officials shook hands. Awards were prepared, but inside a sealed folder, one that would not surface for over 3 decades, sat a different document entirely. It did not describe a successful mission. It described a human being who had returned from open space, changed from the inside. The question that haunts every page of this investigation is not what Savitskaya did out there. The question is, what did something out there do to her? To understand what happened on that day, in those 70 seconds that Soviet science could not explain and Soviet bureaucracy could not erase, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand the kind of person who walks into the void and does not flinch, because Svetlana Savitskaya was never ordinary. She was built differently, and the records prove it. Born into the sky. She was born on the 8th of August, 1948 in Moscow. Her father was Yevgeny Savitsky, a marshal of aviation, one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet history. A man whose name was carved into the mythology of the Great Patriotic War. The apartment she grew up in smelled of engine oil and leather maps. Technical manuals sat on the shelf beside fairy tales. Before other children her age were reading books, Svetlana was dismantling alarm clocks to understand the mechanism inside. Her teachers described her as focused in a way that made adults uncomfortable, not rebellious, not strange. Simply precise, as if she had arrived already knowing what she was here for. At 9 years old, she stood at the edge of a military airfield with her father and looked up at a jet leaving a white line across the blue. According to a family account recorded in a memoir published in 2003, she turned to him and said, "Papa, there is something up there, high up. I have to get there." Her father laughed. He thought she meant aviation. He was right, but only partly. The Parachute Diary. In 1963, at the age of 15, Svetlana Savitskaya made her first parachute jump. She was the youngest student at the club. The instructor, referred to in surviving records only by the initials NNV, noted something in his logbook that same afternoon. The entry, discovered and cited by Soviet aerospace historian Mikhail Rubtsov in a 2019 publication, reads, "After each jump, her face has an expression as if she has just spoken with someone important. I cannot explain it any other way." This was not a single observation. It became a pattern. Jump after jump, season after season, the same notation reappeared in variant forms. She was not frightened. She was not exhilarated in the typical way. She was returning from somewhere, and she looked like a person who had received information. In a private diary discovered in 2019, a document that had been considered destroyed for decades, recovered from the estate of a deceased colleague, Savitskaya herself wrote an entry dated to the summer of 1963. The translation from Russian reads, "There was something alive there. It was looking at me. I was not afraid. I think I already know it." She was 15 years old. 22 seconds of silence. The first formal anomaly in her official record appears in 1969. She was 20 years old, a licensed pilot and competitive aerobatics champion. During a routine training flight over a Soviet airbase, ground communications lost contact with her aircraft for precisely 22 seconds. When the connection restored, her voice was calm. The controller asked if there had been a technical problem. She said, "Everything's fine, I was talking." The controller asked, "No, talking to whom?" The recording cuts off. The remainder of the exchange is not preserved in any available archive. This would become a recurring motif in the biography of Svetlana Savitskaya. Moments of disconnection, intervals of silence, pauses that the instruments could register but human language could not adequately describe. The 22 seconds of 1969, the 70 seconds of 1984, The numbers are different. The structure is identical. The KGB file with a special marker. What makes the Savitskaya case genuinely extraordinary, what separates it from ordinary biography and pushes it into the territory of a state-level mystery, is what the KGB was doing while she climbed through the ranks of Soviet aviation. Her personal file in KGB records carries a designation that appears on fewer than 100 files in the entire corpus of cosmonaut and military pilot documentation from the Cold War era. Osoby psychologicheski profile, a special psychological profile. This is not a negative classification. It is not a psychiatric warning. It is, as archivists who have reviewed the file confirm, closer to a flag of interest. Something about her was being watched, not because she was dangerous, but because she was remarkable in a way that the state wanted to understand and potentially to use. Between 1968 and 1978, 7 separate informant reports were filed about Savitskaya by colleagues. 7. For context, the average military pilot of her generation attracted 0 such reports during a career. She attracted 7 in a single decade. Most describe behavior that was, by any standard, unremarkable. She was disciplined. She was technically gifted. She did not speak against the state. She did not associate with dissidents. The informant seemed almost frustrated, reporting not on what she did, but on what she said in unguarded moments. One report dated 1978 records a remark she made during a late-night conversation at a training facility. The quote preserved in the archival file, "One day I will see what only the dead see, or those who go past the edges of the world." She said it casually, as if commenting on the weather. The Medical Commission and the Paradox. In 1981, Savitskaya underwent the standard medical and psychological assessment for entry into the Soviet Cosmonaut Corps. The process was rigorous, designed to filter out psychological instability, emotional volatility, any tendency toward dissociation or abnormal perception under stress. She passed, she more than passed, but the medical records contain a phrase that does not appear in any other candidate's file from that cohort. Under the category of sensory deprivation testing, a procedure where candidates are placed in isolation tanks and monitored for signs of anxiety or hallucination, the examiner wrote, "Paradoxical calm and pleasant visual phenomena reported by subject." Most candidates found sensory deprivation deeply unsettling. Savitskaya found it pleasant. She described visual experiences during the isolation that she characterized not as hallucinations, but as recognition, as if she were seeing something she had seen before and was glad to see again. The committee reviewed the notes. They consulted. They flagged the file. And then they approved her. This is the moment where the story becomes more than biography. Because a state apparatus that had been tracking her for over a decade, that had collected 7 informant reports, that had a KGB file with a special marker, looked at a woman who experienced pleasant visual phenomena during isolation testing and said, "Yes, send her to space. That is not negligence. That is a decision." Someone, somewhere in the hierarchy, had concluded that what made Svetlana Savitskaya unusual was not a liability. It was an asset. The architecture of a destiny. She flew her first mission in August of 1982 aboard the spacecraft Soyuz T-7. She docked with the Salyut 7 station. She performed her duties with the precision and composure that had defined her entire career. And then, on the 3rd night aboard the station, her crewmate Alexander Serebrov wrote something in what would later become known as his unsent letters. Personal notes he kept but chose never to transmit to ground control. The letter from the 3rd night describes Savitskaya lying still in her sleeping compartment, her eyes open, her face turned toward the porthole and the darkness beyond. He wrote that she had not slept in over 24 hours. He asked her what she was looking at. She answered without turning, "What was always out there, it's just closer now." And the last entry in her classified mission journal before the return to Earth, a document that remained sealed for decades, contains a single line translated from Russian. "I'm sad to leave this place. I will remember everything, and I will come back. She came back 2 years later, on July 25th, 1984, and in 70 seconds of open space, everything she had been building toward her entire life, every parachute jump, every silence, every flagged report, every paradoxical calm, converged into something that a 6-page classified medical report could only describe in the end as a person altered from within. The story of what happened in those 70 seconds and what the Soviet state did with the evidence is what comes next. There is a moment in every investigation when the evidence stops being circumstantial, when the pattern stops being a pattern and becomes a fact, when you can no longer say perhaps or possibly or the records suggest. For the case of Svetlana Savitskaya, that moment arrived at 10:41 in the morning on July 25th, 1984. It lasted exactly 70 seconds, and it was measured not by witnesses, not by memory, not by a diary entry found decades later, but by instruments, Soviet instruments, calibrated to military-grade precision, operated by engineers whose job was to detect problems and report them accurately to the state. They detected something, they reported it, and then someone ordered the report buried. This is the story of those 70 seconds. And of the 18 pages written afterward that prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the Soviet Union knew exactly what had happened, and chose deliberately and systematically to make sure the world never found out. The mission that was supposed to be routine. The Soyuz T-12 spacecraft launched on July 17, 1984. On board, cosmonaut Vladimir Janibekov, cosmonaut Igor Volk, and Svetlana Savitskaya. The primary objective of the mission was a series of experiments aboard the Salyut-7 orbital station, including welding and cutting operations to be performed during an extravehicular activity, a spacewalk. Savitskaya had been assigned the technical lead role for this procedure. On paper, it was a mission about metallurgy, about science, about Soviet technological superiority demonstrated to the watching world. Ground control had planned the spacewalk in detail. Duration, approximately 3.5 hours. Tasks, precise, sequential, documented. Janibekov would assist. Savitskaya would perform. Mission control would monitor from below. Everything was mapped, timed, and filed in triplicate. What was not in any filed document, what no one had planned for, what no training simulation had ever produced, was what happened at 10:41, the 70 seconds, 28 minutes into the spacewalk. Janibekov noticed that Savitskaya had stopped moving. She had been working steadily, cutting, welding, manipulating the equipment with the focused efficiency that had characterized her entire career. And then she simply stopped. Her tools hung motionless in her gloved hands. Her helmet was turned slightly away from the station, facing outward, toward open space, toward the absolute darkness punctuated by the cold fire of stars. Janibekov called her name through the communications channel. Nothing. He called again. A pause, and then, clearly, calmly, in a voice that ground control personnel later described in private notes as utterly without urgency, she said a single word. Padoji. Wait. So they waited. The biomedical monitoring systems aboard her suit recorded the following during those 70 seconds. Her pulse dropped from 72 beats per minute to 44. Her respiration slowed from 14 breaths per minute to 3. Muscular activity in her limbs fell to near zero. The readings consistent with a body in deep sleep or the earliest stages of hibernation. But the final data point is the one that cannot be explained by any of these frameworks. Neural activity, measured through sensors embedded in her helmet, surged. While her body was shutting down toward stillness, her brain was doing the opposite. The readings spiked. Whatever was happening to Svetlana Savitskaya in those 70 seconds, it was not sleep, it was not a seizure, it was not mechanical failure. Her mind, by every available measure, was more active than it had been at any point during the spacewalk. And then there is the external anomaly. At the precise moment, Savitskaya went still, not before, not after, but simultaneously. 3 separate ground-based monitoring stations in different geographic locations registered an electromagnetic disturbance in the frequency range surrounding the Salyut 7 orbital path. The disturbance lasted 70 seconds. It ended when Savitskaya resumed movement. The 3 stations were not in communication with each other during the event. They recorded it independently. The correlation was discovered only later during the review process, and it was the correlation that made the reviewers understand that what they were dealing with was not an internal event inside one human body. Something external had been present, something measurable, something real. What she said afterward. When Savitskaya returned inside the station, Johnny Bekov asked her what had happened. The exchange was recorded in the mission audio log. Her response in the archive transcript, "I needed a moment." He asked if she was feeling well. She said, "Better than I have ever felt in my life." The formal debriefing came later after landing, and it is here in 6 pages of classified testimony, compiled by a joint medical and psychological review team and immediately sealed under the highest available security classification, that the investigation reaches its most extraordinary material. Savitskaya described what happened during those 70 seconds not as a vision, not as a hallucination, and emphatically not as a dream. She used a specific and repeated phrase, understanding without words. 3 distinct understandings, she said, had arrived in her mind, not transmitted as language, not as images, but as direct comprehension, the way you know your own name without having to hear it spoken. The first understanding, life is not an exception in the universe. It is the universe's primary property. The darkness of space is not emptiness. It is full. What appears to human instruments as void is in reality a medium, a substrate, a field in which consciousness operates at scales and densities that human science in 1984 had no framework to measure. The second understanding, the boundary between a human being and the surrounding space, is a biological illusion. The skin, the suit, the walls of the spacecraft, these create a subjective sense of separation that does not correspond to any deeper reality. She was not inside a suit floating in space. She was, for those 70 seconds, continuous with it. The third understanding was the one that the review team underlined twice in the archive document. Humanity is in a childhood period, a vast, patient, organized intelligence. Her word was razum, meaning mind or reason, is actively waiting, not passively, not indifferently, actively. It knows we exist. It is observing our development, and it is waiting for the moment when we are ready for something she could only describe as contact in the full sense. 6 pages, every sentence of which was classified on the day it was written. The 18 pages. In November of 1984, an internal Soviet document was produced by a review committee whose membership is still not fully established. It ran to 18 pages. For over 3 decades, its existence was unknown outside a small circle. Then in the spring of 2017, an anonymous individual delivered a sealed envelope to a Moscow archive. No name, no return address. Inside, 18 pages of original Soviet bureaucratic paper, typed in the characteristic font of 1984 Kremlin documents, bearing classification stamps that archivists subsequently confirmed as authentic. Forensic document analysis conducted by 3 independent experts between 2017 and 2019 confirmed the paper, ink, and typeface consistent with Soviet government documents of the mid-1980s. The classification stamps were verified against known authentic examples. The document was real. What it contained was more significant than any conspiracy theory had imagined. The 18 pages include a complete physiological record of the 70-second event, including the neural spike data and the biomonitor anomalies. A separate section analyzing the electromagnetic disturbance recorded by the 3 ground stations, with a specific notation that the simultaneous independent registration eliminates the possibility of instrument error or coincidence. A psychological assessment of Savitskaya's testimony, written not in the language of pathology but in the language of scientific curiosity, The evaluators were not trying to explain away what she described. They were trying to understand it. And then the recommendations. The committee recommended explicitly that no restrictive measures be applied to Savitskaya. No grounding, no psychiatric evaluation in the punitive sense, no silencing beyond the standard classification protocols. They recommended instead that a second spacewalk be prepared, not as a mission, but as a controlled experiment, with an expanded monitoring protocol designed specifically to capture and study whatever had occurred on July 25th. They wanted to reproduce it. They wanted to study it. They called it, in the clinical language of Soviet bureaucratic prose, a phenomenon of potential scientific significance at the highest order. And they noted, in a single subordinate clause, almost in passing, as if the authors assumed the reader already knew, that this was not the first time. There had been, they wrote, several parallel cases in the preceding 5 years. Several parallel cases. The program that disappeared, the program that had been quietly hunting for people like Savitskaya, people who experienced what the documents called altered states of heightened receptivity during extreme altitude or orbital conditions, had an internal code name, Horizon. Horizon. It operated within the classified layers of the Soviet space medicine establishment, largely invisible even to most participants in the Cosmonaut program. It was not about mental illness. It was about the opposite. Identifying individuals whose psychological architecture seemed to interact with extreme conditions in ways that produced measurable, repeatable phenomena. Savitskaya was, by any measure, its greatest discovery. And then, in March of 1985, Konstantin Chernenko died. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. The political atmosphere shifted. Glasnost began to open certain doors and quietly close others. Horizon was not formally terminated. It simply ceased to receive funding, ceased to appear in planning documents, ceased to schedule meetings. By the end of 1985, it had effectively ceased to exist. The second spacewalk that the 18-page document had recommended, the controlled experiment, the expanded protocol, the chance to understand what had happened on July 25th, was never conducted. Savitskaya remained in the Cosmonaut Corps for 3 more years, technically eligible, technically qualified, her records immaculate. And then, in 1988, she left, quietly, without ceremony. She moved into politics, eventually serving in the Russian State Duma for decades. She never spoke publicly about the 70 seconds in any direct way. She never confirmed the classified testimony. She never denied it either. And that silence, as the third part of this investigation will reveal, is perhaps the most eloquent piece of evidence in the entire case, because the destruction of the records did not begin until after she left the program. Targeted, methodical, specific. Someone wanted to ensure that what Savitskaya had experienced in open space and what Soviet science had concluded about it would remain like the darkness beyond the porthole, invisible to human eyes. Someone almost succeeded. There is a specific kind of silence that is louder than noise. It is the silence of a missing page, the silence of a tape recording that ends 2 seconds before the critical moment, the silence of an archive folder that contains everything except the one document you're looking for. Investigators who work with Cold War materials know this silence well. They have a name for it. They call it purposeful absence, the deliberate removal of evidence so precise in its targeting that the removal itself becomes the evidence. You cannot erase something without leaving the shape of what you erased behind. The investigation into the 70 seconds of July 25, 1984, runs directly into this kind of silence, not once, repeatedly. And the pattern of what is missing, which records, which dates, which names, tells a story that is in some ways more revealing than any document that survived. The cover-up is not a theory. It is a forensic fact, and it began the moment the Soviet Union realized it did not know how to explain what Svetlana Savitskaya had encountered in open space. The cut pages. In 2015, a technical specialist named Dmitry, a retired engineer who had worked in the Kaluga Space Communications Facility during the 1980s, gave a recorded interview to an independent Russian aerospace researcher. He asked that his surname not be published. He was 71 years old. He said he had been waiting for decades to tell someone who would understand. He described the mission logs from July 25, 1984. Physical logbooks, paper, handwritten, the kind that Soviet facilities maintained in parallel with electronic systems as a redundancy measure. He said he had seen them in the months following the mission. He had referenced them during a subsequent technical review. They were complete, intact, detailed. When he returned to the same archive in 1989, the logbooks were still there, but 2 pages were missing, not lost, not misfiled, cut. The binding showed the remnants of pages that had been removed with a blade. The entries for a specific 2-minute window on July 25, 1984, corresponding precisely to the period of the electromagnetic anomaly and the 70-second pause, were gone. He reported the missing pages to his supervisor. He was told the matter had been reviewed and resolved at a higher level. He was told not to raise it again. He did not raise it again until that recorded interview 3 decades later. The user who disappeared in the spring of 2018, a participant in a Russian online forum dedicated to Soviet space history, posted a thread under the username Antenshchik84, a reference to radio antenna operators, the kind of technical personnel who would have staffed the ground monitoring stations in the 1980s. The post claimed that the user had access to duplicate audio recordings of the Soyuz T-12 mission communications, backup copies made by a ground station that had not been included in the official archival sweep. The post described specific phrases in the recordings that did not appear in any published or officially released transcript. The user offered to share fragments with researchers who could verify their authenticity. The post attracted significant attention in the small community of Soviet space history investigators. Replies accumulated over several days. Researchers began reaching out. Then the account went silent. The post remained visible for approximately 3 weeks before disappearing entirely. Not just the user's activity, but the thread itself and eventually the account. Those who had bookmarked the original URL found it returning a standard error message. 2 researchers who had initiated private contact with the account reported that their messages were never answered. The identity of Antenshchik84 has never been established. The recordings, if they existed, have never surfaced. The Years of Destruction. The historian and aerospace researcher Nikolai Rubtsov, who has published 3 volumes on classified Soviet space medicine programs, documented in his 2021 work what he called a coordinated archival reduction, targeting materials related to the Gorizont program and associated cosmonaut psychological records. His research identified the period between 1988 and 1992 as the primary window of activity. This is not coincidental timing. 1988 is the year Savitskaya left the Cosmonaut Corps. 1992 is the year following the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union, the period of maximum institutional chaos when archives were simultaneously being opened to partial public scrutiny and, in parallel, being quietly purged of the most sensitive materials. Someone used the disorder of collapse as cover for a final systematic removal. Rubtsov estimates that between 40 and 60% of the original Gorizont documentation was destroyed during this window. What remains is fragmentary. The 18-page document delivered anonymously in 2017 is, by his assessment, the most complete surviving artifact of the program's work, which is precisely why its anonymous delivery, decades after the destruction campaign, raises questions that no one has yet answered. Who kept it? Why wait until 2017, and why deliver it at all? 7 cases, 1 pattern. In the summer of 2021, during a routine cataloging process at a regional archive in central Russia, an archivist discovered a 3-page document tucked inside an unrelated folder of administrative correspondence from the late 1980s. The document appeared to have been misfiled. accidentally preserved through bureaucratic error rather than deliberate protection. It was a summary document written in the terse, abbreviated style of Soviet internal briefings. It described in bullet point form 7 separate incidents involving Soviet cosmonauts and military pilots between 1968 and 1986. Each incident was characterized by an unexplained interruption in normal behavior during high altitude or orbital conditions, subsequent testimony describing an experience of presence, something vast, aware, and organized, and physiological readings that deviated from baseline in consistent ways. The 7 cases were not identified by name. They were assigned numbers, but the description attached to case number 6 matches the July 1984 event in every specific detail. The duration, the physiological profile, the electromagnetic correlation, the nature of the reported experience. Case number 6 is Savitskaya, and the other 6 cases carry their own weight, because what is most significant about the 3-page document is not any individual case. It is the language used across all 7. The descriptions of what each person experienced, written separately, filed separately by different evaluators about different people in different years, converge on a single formulation with an exactness that cannot be attributed to coincidence or standardized reporting language. All 7 describe the same thing: a presence, vast, living, intelligent, which knows of you and which is waiting. 7 people, 7 different moments, 7 different locations in the upper atmosphere or low Earth orbit. One description: the Western Mirror. The Soviet Union was not operating in isolation. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, inside the American space program, something was also being noticed, and also being quietly managed. Edgar Mitchell, lunar module pilot of Apollo 14, returned from the moon in February of 1971 and spent the rest of his life trying to describe what he had experienced in transit. A sudden, overwhelming sense of universal connectedness that he called a flash of understanding. He was so affected that he founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1973, a research organization dedicated to studying consciousness and its relationship to the physical universe. NASA did not fund it. NASA did not discuss it. Mitchell paid for it himself from his own pocket and spent 40 years building a scientific framework for something he encountered in 3 days of deep space travel. Russell Schweickart, who performed a spacewalk during Apollo 9 in March of 1969, described the experience of floating outside the spacecraft in terms that NASA's Public Relations Office never included in official mission summaries: a merging with the universe, a dissolution of the boundary between self and cosmos, a sense of being perceived, not observed passively, but recognized by something that encompassed the entire field of his vision. His private notes from the period, released partially through a 2008 archival process, use a phrase that appears in no official NASA document: "It knew I was there." And in declassified CIA interview transcripts from the late 1980s and 1990s, sessions conducted with Soviet émigré scientists and military personnel as part of standard intelligence debriefing processes. Researchers have identified a cluster of testimonies that contain language strikingly similar to Savitskaya's classified 6-page report. References to a voice that was not sound, to understanding without words, to something enormous that was not frightening because it was familiar. The CIA analysts who conducted those interviews were looking for military and technical intelligence. They were not looking for this. The transcripts show no follow-up questions on these specific passages. They were noted, filed, and forgotten, but they are there, and the language matches. The silence that speaks. Since leaving the Cosmonaut Corps in 1988, Svetlana Savitskaya has made hundreds of public appearances. She has given interviews. She has addressed students. She has spoken at aerospace conferences and government proceedings. In none of these appearances has she ever directly described the 70 seconds of July 25, 1984, but in none of them has she denied it either. This is a specific and deliberate posture. A person who had experienced nothing unusual would have no reason to avoid the subject. A person who had been ordered to deny something would typically deny it, because denial is the standard protocol. Savitskaya does neither. She approaches the edge of the subject and then speaks around it, in words that are technically deniable, but semantically unmistakable to anyone who knows what to listen for. In 2008, responding to a question from a university student about what it feels like to float in open space, she said, "It is very quiet there, quiet inside you too, and you understand that the most important thing is very large." In 2016, asked at a public forum whether she believed the universe was empty, she replied without hesitation, "I think the universe is not as empty as it seems to us." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The questions that remain. Every serious investigation reaches a point where the evidence runs out and the questions begin. This investigation has reached that point. What it leaves behind is not resolution. It is the precise shape of what is still hidden. Who is VK? The individual identified in a 1983 internal letter cited in the 18-page document, whose personal intervention is described as decisive in the decision to approve Savitskaya's assignment to the 1984 mission. The initials appear once and are never explained. Someone with those initials wanted her in space. Someone with the authority to override committee hesitation. Who? Who delivered the sealed envelope to the Moscow archive in 2017? The 18-page document had survived the destruction campaign of 1988 to 92. Someone had protected it for 3 decades. Someone decided in 2017 specifically that the time had come for it to be found. Why that year? Why that archive? Why anonymously, rather than through any of the established channels for document disclosure that exist in post-Soviet Russia? What happened to the 6 other cosmonauts and pilots described in the 3-page 2021 discovery? Their cases were summarized, their full testimonies, if they were ever recorded in the way Savitskaya's were, have not surfaced. Are they destroyed? Are they hidden? Are they waiting in another folder in another regional archive to be found by another archivist during another routine cataloging process? And the largest question, the one that sits beneath all the others like the electromagnetic anomaly beneath the orbital path. If both superpowers, independently in parallel, encountered the same phenomenon during the same historical window, and both chose to bury the evidence rather than study it, what exactly were they afraid of? Not of the unknown. Scientists are not afraid of the unknown. They are drawn to it. What they are afraid of is the answer. An answer that does not fit inside the frameworks of either Cold War ideology, neither the materialist atheism of Soviet science nor the technocratic rationalism of NASA's engineering culture. An answer that suggests the cosmos is not a stage on which human history plays out, but a presence watching, patient, already aware of us, long before we became aware of it. Savitskaya floated in open space on July 25, 1984, and in 70 seconds she received what she described as 3 understandings delivered without words. The Soviet Union spent years trying to classify, contain, and ultimately erase what those 70 seconds produced. The documents that survived the erasure point in one direction consistently, without exception. She did not have a malfunction out there. She made contact. And somewhere in a sealed archive, in a folder that has not yet been found, in the handwriting of a Soviet bureaucrat who was simply trying to do his job and record what he had witnessed, the full account of what that contact contained is waiting. It is very quiet there. And the most important thing is very large.